Hi everyone, it's Amanda. So today I'll be going over chapter 4 of our Drugs and Behavior textbook. The title of the chapter is the nervous system, and I'll be going over the first quarter of it, which is roughly pages 75 through 80. First, I'll be talking about homeostasis, which is the maintenance of an environment of body functions within a certain range. An example of this would be temperature. Our body has mechanisms to raise or lower temperature, such as sweating or shivering, to keep our bodies at generally 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. It's also important to note that psychoactive drugs can also influence homeostasis. An example of this is when alcohol causes a release of an antidiuretic hormone which increases urination. However, homeostatic processes mobilize to counteract some alcohol-related effects, such as when heavy drinkers have less urine output than infrequent drinkers, or when during alcohol withdrawal, heavy drinkers exhibit an increase in vasopressin release, which is the antidiuretic hormone I was just talking about, which results in greater water retention. Next, we'll be talking about the nervous system, or more specifically, neurons. Neurons are the primary elements of the nervous system. They are responsible for analyzing and transmitting information, and the nervous system contains more than 100 billion neurons. Each neuron is contained within a single membrane that separates the inside and outside of the neuron. All have 4 defined regions. First is the cell body, which contains the processes that maintain the life of the neuron. Next are the dendrites, which are responsible for receiving incoming signals from other neurons. Then there's the axon, which transmits signals to other neurons. And lastly, the axon terminals, which stores neurotransmitters, which are basically chemical messengers. Moving on to the nervous system, we have the glia. About 90% of the cells in the human brain are glia, and they have several functions: providing firmness and structure to the brain, getting nutrients in the system, eliminating waste, and forming myelin, which is a fatty white substance wrapped around portions of the axons. Glia also creates the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier prevents many drugs from entering the brain. This semi-permeable structure protects the brain from potentially toxic chemicals. It's also important to note that in order for a drug to be psychoactive, its molecules must be capable of passing through the blood-brain barrier. Now we'll be talking about neurotransmission and action potential. Neurotransmission is the process of transferring information between neurons at a synapse. The communication between neurons is accomplished through action potential. Action potential is the electrical signal transmitted along the axon when a neuron fires that allows one neuron to communicate with another through the release of neurotransmitters. Action potential occurs due to the opening of ion channels, which allows electrically charged particles called ions to move inside of the cell. This change moves the cell membranes away from its resting potential to a more positively charged voltage. Now, there was a lot of confusing vocabulary in there, so I'll be going over some definitions. First, we have ion channels, which are pores formed in the cell membrane that allow the passage of ions from one side of the membrane to the other. Next is ion, which is an atom or molecule that has a net electrical charge because of a difference in the number of electrons and protons. Lastly, we have resting potential, which is the voltage maintained by a cell when it's not generating action potentials. And the resting potential of neurons is about negative 65 MV. When the cell membrane is at rest, there is an uneven distribution of ions between the outside and inside of the cell. The neuron can be hyperpolarized, which is when the membrane potential is more negative. When the ion channels open and close, it generates action potential. As a result, the cell is depolarized, which is when the membrane potential is less negative. Next, I'll be talking about the somatic nervous system. The nerve cells that are on the front lines, interacting with the external environment, are referred to as the somatic system. These peripheral nerves carry sensory information into the central nervous system and carry motor or movement information back out. An example are cranial nerves that relate to vision, hearing, taste, smell, chewing, and movements of the face and tongue. Next, there is the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system, or ANS, regulates the visceral or involuntary functions of the body, such as heart rate and blood pressure. The ANS controls and monitors the body's internal environment. Many psychoactive drugs have simultaneous effects in the brain and on the ANS. Another important note is that the same transmitter can have different effects depending on the receptor being activated. Next, the ANS is divided into two branches. First is sympathetic, which is the branch involved in fight or flight reactions. Then there is parasympathetic, which stimulates digestion, slows the heart, and has other effects associated with a relaxed physiological state. Then below I have some examples of sympathetic and parasympathetic effects. For the pupil, a sympathetic example would be dilation, while a parasympathetic example would be constriction. For heart rate, sympathetic, the heart rate would increase, and for parasympathetic, the heart rate would decrease. For breathing rate, the sympathetic effect would be fast and shallow, while the parasympathetic effect would be slow and deep. For sweat glands, sympathetic would be secretion, and parasympathetic would have no effect. And then lastly, for the stomach and intestinal glands, sympathetic would be inhibition, while parasympathetic would be activation. Lastly, we have the central nervous system. The central nervous system, or CNS, consists of the brain and spinal cord, from a central mass of nervous tissue with sensory nerves coming in and motor nerves going out. This is where most of the integration of information, learning and memory, and coordination of activity occur.